Hey everyone, this is a piece by Christos Memos. Actually, it's an interview by Christos Memos of Kostas Axelos. What was I going to say? Wikipedia says Kostas Axelos lived from 1924 to 2010 and was a Greek-French philosopher. It says Axelos was born in Athens in 1924 to a doctor and a woman from an old Athenian bourgeois family and attended high school at the French Institute and the Valve at Keio High School. Axelos enrolled in the School of Law of the University of Athens in order to pursue studies in law and economics due to dissatisfaction with the philosophy taught at the School of Philosophy of the University of Athens, but did not attend. With the onset of World War II, Axelos got involved in politics. Then, during the German and Italian occupations, he participated in the Greek resistance and later on in the prelude to the Greek Civil War as an organizer and journalist affiliated with the Communist Party, 1941 to 45. He was later expelled from the Communist Party and condemned to death by the right-wing government. He was arrested but managed to escape. At the end of 1945, Axelos moved to Paris, France on the Mataroa voyage with around 200 other persecuted intellectuals, where he studied philosophy at the Sorbonne and lived most of his life. From 1950 to 1957, he worked as a researcher in the philosophy branch of CRNS, where he was writing his dissertations, and subsequently proceeded to work in École pratique des hautes études. From 1962 to 1973, Axelos taught philosophy at the Sorbonne and met Jacques Lacan, Pablo Picasso, and Martin Heidegger. Axelos' 1959 primary doctoral thesis, Marx, Penseur de la Technique, translated as Marx, the man who thinks through technique, tried to provide an understanding of modern technology based on the thought of Heidegger and Marx and was very influential in the 1960s alongside the philosophy of Herbert Marcuse. Kostas Axelos' secondary thesis was on Heraclitus and was eventually published in 1962 as Héraclite et la philosophie, la première saisie de l'être en devenir de la totalité. Heraclitus and Philosophy, the first grasp of the being in becoming of totality. Axelos was a collaborator on, columnist with, and subsequently editor of the magazine Arguments from 1956 to 1962. He founded and since 1960 has run the book series Arguments in Les Éditions de Nuit. The journal had links to other European publications, e.g. Praxis in Yugoslavia and Das Argument in Germany, and pursued a non-sectarian Marxist approach. He has published texts mostly in French, but also in Greek and German. His most important book is Le Jeu du Monde, The Play of the World, where Axelos argues for a pre-ontological status of play. Because of his activity in connection to major European intellectual figures, Axelos played a central role in French and European intellectual life for over 50 years. Kostas Axelos tried to reconcile the ancient thinking of Heraclitus with the modern thinking of Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Heidegger, and others in order to gain a new perspective on some of the problems of Marxism during his time. Axelos used Heraclitus's philosophy as the primary basis for assessing the work of Marx and Engels. Axelos contributed to the growing interest of contemporary researchers in pre-Socratics, and generally for ancient Greek philosophy through his reading of the role of concepts in interpreting the world. Axelos' starting point was the argument in Marx's thesis that, quote, the world's becoming philosophical is at the same time philosophy is becoming worldly, that its realization is at the same time its loss, end quote. In his dissertation, Marx, the man who thinks through technique, and his work, Alienation, Techne, and Praxis, in the thought of Karl Marx, Axelos draws heavily on the economic and philosophical manuscripts, reading them with the help of Heidegger's and Nietzsche's concepts. Axelos explored the consequences of, quote, alienation in history, such as the effects of the division of labor, private property, and capital, in terms of the, quote, externalization and, quote, of human beings in a, quote, alien reality. Axelos tried to relate these descriptions of alienation and loss of, quote, play to Heidegger's concept of technological, quote, enframing as standing reserve, Bestand. For Axelos, this expanded understanding of technology became a way of interrogating both modern society and Marxism. Following the example of his teacher Heidegger, who employed a poetic style of philosophy, Axelos often used a continuous flow of aphoristic statements to relate phenomena together, attempting to listen to the, quote, game of the world, end quote. Using this method to approach the, quote, horizons of the world, end quote, Axelos unpacks the, quote, mythological elements, end quote, of Marxism and especially criticizes tendencies toward meta-narrative that he considers nihilistic and anthropocentric. Axelos' two doctoral theses and his book Towards Planetary Thinking in 1964 were arranged as a trilogy, The Unfolding of Errance. Axelos continued to engage with contemporary thinking in the emerging global world by seeking to discover the, quote, unseen horizon encircling all things, end quote, further refining his method of a continuous wandering through the splintered, quote, wholeness that surrounds contemporary human beings. To describe this state of, quote, being and becoming, end quote, Axelos uses the term, quote, the game, end quote. This is the basis of Axelos' second trilogy entitled The Unfolding of the Game, which includes the books The Game of the World, 1969, Towards an Ethics of Problematics, 1972, and Contribution to Logic, 1977. Finally, Axelos' third trilogy is entitled The Unfolding of an Investigation and consists of the books Arguments of an Investigation, 1969, Horizons of the World, 1974, and Issues of Stake, 1979. In employing both Marx and Freud, Axelos did not carelessly reject their arguments, despite trying to, quote, liberate the vital forces, end quote, within them. As his autobiography notes, quote, it remains to ask again, to extrapolate the Marxian and Freudian intuitions, end quote. Axelos, 1997. The focus of the searches is still the, quote, set game of sets, end quote, especially in the context of the, quote, end of history debates. This is restated as follows, quote, since everything has been said and contradicted in a specific language, mainly the metaphysical language of philosophy and the language of anti-philosophy that subverts the metaphysical, is there still something of meaning to say, and in what language, end quote, 1974. After completion of the third trilogy, Axelos published Open Systems, 1984, as an extension of the concepts that he had hitherto employed on, quote, exposures in the world, quote, with a means of capturing and writing also, end quote, the different and enormous, quote, wanderings of the open world, end quote, i.e. what is not present at hand, but what is, quote, overwhelming more people and more historical societies, end quote. Axelos' texts were almost all written as metaphilosophical epilogues with the intention not to, quote, passively endure our time. The inquiries that we have launched require us to look and see both near and far, end quote, 1997. The ultimate goal is to write, quote, in a speech poetic and thoughtful, a fervent life, end quote, 1997. Open Marxism. Axelos' approach to thinking and philosophizing can be called, quote, open Marxism, a term Axelos himself used. However, Axelos identified aspects of modern technological thinking that need to be criticized within Marx's texts, leading him to read Marx as the culminating figure of Western metaphysics, paralleling Heidegger's assessment of Nietzsche. Open Marxism is therefore an attempt to transcend the political ideological role of Marxism and to instead, quote, pose fruitful questions and demystify, quote, existing realizations, end quote, end quote. Axelos stressed that all kinds of action, political or otherwise, cannot be defined a priori. Axelos' thought attempts to question all forms of closure, Axelos' thought attempts to question all forms of closure and is a form of open systems theory as opposed to closed systems theory. Elsewhere he calls this, quote, planetary thinking. New section. The concept of, quote, play. Axelos uses the concept of, quote, play, le jeu, both as an ontological category, the, quote, system of systems, end quote, and as an ethical ideal for an unalienated society. Axelos argues, following Marx, but the opposition between work, necessity, and play, freedom, needs to be abolished, but recognizes that this would be both a concrete and ontological, quote, world play, end quote, le jeu du monde, or errance. He also argues, following Heidegger, that play is the meaning of being which has been forgotten in the modern world, the oblivion of being. Critiquing overly determinist accounts of globalization, for example, Axelos argues that it is a process of world forming, mondialisation, which is more open to transformation than classical Marxist theorists often admit. The relational aspect of play is what links human activity and the activity of the world, and the various systems of human life, magic, myth, religion, poetry, politics, philosophy, science, together and to the world. Thus play is not at all a childish vocation for Axelos. Okay, so now that that's very long introduction is done, we can start. The interview begins with a poem by a C.P. Cavafy. C.P. Cavafy is a poet from Greece. Constantine P. Cavafy. Constantine P. Cavafy lived from 1863 to 1933, was a Greek poet, journalist, and civil servant from Alexandria. A major figure of modern Greek literature, he is sometimes considered the most distinguished Greek poet of the 20th century. C.P. Cavafy's work and consciously individual style earned him a place among the most important contributors not only to Greek poetry, but to Western poetry as a whole. C.P. Cavafy's poetic canon consists of 154 poems, while dozens more that remained incomplete or in sketch form weren't published until much later. C.P. Cavafy consistently refused to publish his work in books, preferring to share it through local newspapers and magazines, or even print it himself and give it away to anyone who might be interested. C.P. Cavafy's most important poems were written after his 40th birthday and were published 2 years after his death. C.P. Cavafy's work has been translated numerous times in many languages. His friend E.M. Forster, the novelist and literary critic, first introduced C.P. Cavafy's poems to the English-speaking world in 1923. He referred to him as, quote, the poet, famously describing him as, quote, a Greek gentleman in a straw hat, standing absolutely motionless at a slight angle to the universe, end quote. C.P. Cavafy's work, as one translator put it, holds the historical and erotic in a single embrace, end quote. So that's who C.P. Cavafy is, and the poem that is the interview starts with is titled Walls. Without consideration, without pity, without shame, they have built big and high walls around me, and now I sit here despairing, and think of nothing else. The fate gnaws at my mind, for I had many things to do outside. Ah, why didn't I observe them when they were building the walls? But I never heard the noise or the sound of the builders. Imperceptibly they shut me out of the world. Okay, that's the end of the poem. Introduction. Have, quote, big and high walls, end quote, been built around the several Marxisms that have shut them, quote, out of the world, end quote? If so, who were the builders? To what extent was Marx himself responsible for the closure, crisis, and withering away, both of Marxism and the labor movement? To paraphrase Lenin, was Marx's theory an infantile disorder of Marxism? Or is there something in Marx's argument that facilitated the petrification of Marxism? Were there ingredients and seeds of this metamorphosis of Marxism that could be traced back to Marx himself? To deal with these questions at all during the 1950s and 1960s, and to make the claim that you would be looking at them from a radical angle, was almost a scandal. More specifically, at the beginning of the Cold War period, it seemed to be extremely difficult for a scholar to articulate and defend a method for analyzing Marxist positions, and elaborating his concepts without mystification and ideological entrenchments. Moreover, one could say that for a radical thinker to publicly, quote, negate the positivist element of Marx and Marxism, or to exercise a, quote, destructive critique against their shortcomings, could lead to unpleasant consequences. He was, quote, likely to be forced to live in the shadows, end quote. Agnoli, 2003. Obviously, he could have been forced to, quote, live in the shadows, end quote, by the, quote, Marxist scholars, political parties and regimes that had transformed Marxism into an ideology and a, quote, dead dogma, end quote. And behind them, by the interest in social relations that had produced this ideology. Thus, the several Marxist trends, political parties and groups, or the Soviet-type regimes had contributed enormously to the cult of Marx by creating a, quote, myth, a, quote, legend, for Marx and his works. In many cases, the glorification of Marx took religious dimensions and kept pace with the mystification of his writings. In doing so, they cancelled Marx's revolutionary and liberating elements, and at the same time they continued to reproduce stereotypes and presuppositions. There were, however, some scholars who went against the tide, chose to pass through the Scylla, Scyla, of Stalinism, and the Charybdis of the, quote, marketization, end quote, of the role of intellectuals, and view themselves as, quote, independent leftist intellectuals, end quote. Among other scholars, this has been the case with Kostas Axelos, a Greek scholar relatively unknown in the Anglo-Saxon world, who has lived and written in France since the close of the Second World War. Kostas Axelos was born in Athens on the 26th of June 1924 and was the offspring of a bourgeois family. His father was a doctor and his mother came from an old Athenian family. Axelos' formative years were very significant for his future ideological and political evolution. Axelos received a multilingual education. While still in secondary education, Axelos attended classes at both the French Institute of Athens and the German School. Axelos also showed an interest in philosophy at this early stage and became familiar with ancient Greek philosophical and political thought. As he considered that the philosophical school of the University of Athens at that time was inadequate to offer a satisfactory level of the teaching of philosophy, Axelos decided to enroll in the faculty of law. Axelos did not, however, manage to attend, since he was obliged to go underground to avoid arrest. Thus, though Axelos was of bourgeois origin, Axelos had been through painful and unique experiences that formed his personality and his intellectual background. He lived under the dictatorship of the 4th of August 1936 regime and the Nazi occupation of Greece, joining the Greek communist movement and the Greek resistance. Wikipedia says the 4th of August regime. The 4th of August regime, also commonly known as the Metaxas regime, was an authoritarian regime under the leadership of Ioannis Metaxas, I might be saying that wrong, that ruled the Kingdom of Greece from 1936 to 1941. On the 4th of August 1936, Metaxas, with the support of King George II, suspended the Greek parliament and went on to preside over a conservative, staunchly anti-communist government. The regime took inspiration in symbolism and rhetoric from fascist Italy, but retained close links to Britain and the French Third Republic, rather than the Axis powers. Lacking a popular base, after Metaxas' death in January 1941, the regime hinged entirely on the king. Although Greece was occupied following the German invasion of Greece in April 1941 and the Greek government was forced into exile in the British-controlled Kingdom of Egypt, several prominent figures of the regime, notably the notorious security chief Konstantinos Maniadakis, survived for several months in cabinet until the king was forced to dismiss them in a compromise with the representatives of the old democratic political establishment. Back to the text. So, Axelos lived under the dictatorship of the 4th of August 1936 regime in the Nazi occupation of Greece, joining the Greek communist movement and the Greek resistance. He realized what Stalinism would mean, and at that time, he fought against British imperialism. The armed conflict of December 1944 For his political action, he was persecuted, jailed, and sentenced to death by a court of the right-wing government. Wikipedia says there's this thing called the December events, or the Decembriana, which refers to a series of clashes fought during World War II in Athens from the 3rd of December 1944 to the 11th of January 1945. The conflict was the culmination of months of tension between the left-wing EAM, some parts of its military arm, the ELAS, stationed in Athens, the KKE, and the OPLA from one side, and from the other side, the Greek government, some parts of the Hellenic Royal Army, the Hellenic Gendarmerie, the city's police, the Organization X, among others, and also the British Army. Regardless of the tensions between the left and the right, in May 1944 it had been roughly agreed in the Lebanon Conference that all non-collaborationist factions would participate in a government of national unity. Eventually, 6 out of 24 ministers were appointed by EAM. Additionally, a few weeks before the withdrawal of the German troops in October 1944, it had been reaffirmed in the Caserta Agreement that all collaborationist forces would be tried and punished accordingly, and that all resistance forces would participate in the formation of the new Greek army under the command of the British. Yet on the 1st of December, the British commander Ronald Scobie ordered the unilateral disarmament of EAM-ELAS. The EAM ministers resigned on the 2nd of December, and EAM called for a rally in central Athens on the 3rd, requesting the immediate punishment of the collaborationist security battalions and the withdrawal of the Scobie order. The rally of some 200,000 people was shot at by the Greek police and gendarmerie, leaving 28 protesters dead and 148 wounded. These killings ushered a full-blown armed confrontation between EAM and the government forces at first, which included the security battalions, and during the second half of December between EAM and the British military forces. The clashes were limited to Athens, while elsewhere in Greece the situation remained tense but peaceful, with the exception of Epirus, where Aris Valouchiotis attacked the forces of Napoleon Zervas. The Decembriana ended with the defeat of EAM-ELAS, leading to its disarmament in the Varkiza Agreement, which marked the end of ELAS. This first defeat broke the power of EAM. This, together with the EAM-instigated Red Terror, was followed by a period of White Terror against the Greek left, which contributed to the outbreak of the Greek Civil War in 1946. The clashes of Decembriana were among the bloodiest battles in modern Greek history, with a high rate of civilian deaths. Back to the text. Finally, in December 1945, Kostas Axelos, along with Cornelius Castoriadis and Kostas Papaiouanou, joined approximately 200 Greek intellectuals and students leftists in the main and persecuted by the rightist government, who sailed on the Matoroa from Piraeus to France, thanks to a scholarship provided by the French government. In France, Kostas Axelos studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, and in 1959 he submitted his 2 theses. Heraclitus in Philosophy and Alienation, Praxis, and Techne in the Thought of Karl Marx. Axelos worked as a researcher for the National Center of Scientific Research 1950 to 1957 and taught philosophy at the Sorbonne from 1962 to 1973. During this period he met Lacan, Picasso, and Heidegger. Axelos joined the editorial board of the journal Arguments in 1858 and later on was its editor-in-chief, 1960 to 62. Let's see what the how you actually pronounce that.
Argument. Argument.
Argument. Axelos joined the editorial board of the journal Argument in 1958 and later on was its editor-in-chief from 1960 to 62. The journal had links with other European publications such as Praxis in Yugoslavia, Nova Kultura in Poland, and Das Argument in Germany. I'm going to assume you know the Praxis school. Let's see if there's anything for the... I'm not really seeing anything for Nova Kultura in Poland. Actually, sorry. The Das Argument, or the Argument, Journal for Philosophy and Social Sciences, was founded in 1959 as an independent academic journal of a Marxist-oriented West German left. The journal is published by Argument Verlag in 4 issues per year, with the last issue of the year usually being a double issue. Since 2005, the journal has been published by the Berlin Institute for Critical Theory, is a cooperation partner of Linksnet. With issue 342 published in 2024, the journal will be discontinued in its current form. According to Haug, the continuation is still open. The review section should be continued. Back to the text. According to Poster, Argument, quote, was the only Marxist journal in the period of the later 1950s and early 1960s to avoid sectarianism. It therefore became an important center for exchange of ideas, for an opening up of Marxism towards new intellectual currents and new social phenomenon, end quote. Poster. And I don't know what poster he's referring to, so I'm just going to carry on. As Axelos has put it, quote, I would say, briefly, that an attempt at an open Marxism, of a revised and corrected Freudo-Marxism, and finally a post-Marxist and post-Heideggerian thought were elaborated, but not without difficulties, end quote. Axelos. According to Arguments, contributors to Argument included some of the most important leftist French thinkers such as Edgar Morin, Jean d'Auvignon, Pierre Fouguet-Rolas, Henri Lefebvre, Maurice Blanchot, Gilles Deleuze, Roland Barthes, François Fejtou. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Finally, Argument folded in 1962. Then Kostas Axelos launched and directed the book series Argument that translated and published writers such as Korsch, Marcuse, Trotsky, Hilferding, Carr, Hegel, Novalis, Bataille, Deleuze, Jaspers, and Wittfogel. In 1960, Axelos translated into French Lukács's most influential work, History and Class Consciousness, despite Lukács's objection to this publication and Heidegger's What is Philosophy? During this period, Axelos coined the term, quote, open Marxism, and attempted to, quote, open a window in the, quote, walls that have led to the petrification of various Marxisms. Later meeting with Heideggerian thought, Axelos moved from his Marxist positions, following a different intellectual course. In this interview, we are not going to follow Axelos in his later, quote, intellectual errancies, end quote, but we'll focus on Axelos's critical approach to Marxist thought by drawing on the following texts: Alienation, Praxis, and Techne and the Thought of Karl Marx from 1976, and something in Greek from 1989, and Einführung in ein künftiges Denken über Marx und Heidegger from 1966, and Thesis on Marx from 1982. Alright, so we finally have gotten to the interview. Here we go. The interview. Christos Memos. What were the specific historical, social, and political circumstances in Greece that shaped your experience and determined your attitude toward Marx and Marxism? Axelos. I grew up in a liberal family and at the age of 17 joined the Greek communist youth movement. I was a leader and a theoretician in the student movement. Thus I was provided the opportunity to become familiar with so-called, quote, real Marxism. On the one hand, my participation in the communist movement was a valuable life experience. I somewhat came to understand the vibration of both Greek and world history, and at the same time I experienced comradeship, since we used to spend all day long together. On the other hand, having been pissed off with the bourgeoisie, I thought that Marxism was an open society, but very soon realized that there was too much dogmatism and bureaucracy, mainly because of the harsh Stalinist model of the Greek Communist Party. Later on, I took part in the armed conflict of December 1944, the so-called Decembriana, which we already looked up. We were in the Polytechnic University and fought a battle against the security police. But the British tanks closed in upon us and we tried to get away. Some were injured and the rest were captured. However, we managed to escape and rejoin the National People's Liberation Army, ELAS. In short, I had a double negative experience of Greece. First, the experience of the bourgeoisie, from which I came and found suffocating, its ideas, conventions, and morality. I was against the bourgeoisie before joining the Communist Party. I wanted this class to perish. Second, I had the bad experience of the Stalinist bureaucracy. In other words, when I left Greece, I had to shake the dust off my feet from both the bourgeoisie and the Stalinist Communist Party. Since the period I went politically underground, I had wanted to leave Greece. It seemed to me that Greece was, quote, narrow, and gave me the sense of strong ethnocentrism. Ultimately, I left Greece and settled in France thanks to a scholarship given to me by the French government. Christos Memos. Where did you find yourself after immigrating to France? How was the atmosphere? Axelos. The atmosphere was friendly and I immediately started to study philosophy at the Sorbonne. During these first years in France, I systematically studied Heraclitus, Marx, Hegel, and Nietzsche. At a political level, general elections were going to be held when I arrived in France. One could see posters of the French Communist Party with the, quote, political slogan, quote, vote for the French Communist Party, the party of the small property owners, end quote. And I asked myself, quote, was it the small property owners that we had fought for, end quote? In March 1946, I was expelled from the Greek Communist Party because I had stated that it was dogmatic, and I was opposed to the French Communist Party's policy. It's worth mentioning here that during the first post-liberation years, the French Communist Party reached the peak of its political influence and made an endeavor to impose its ideological dominance, along with Sartre and leftist Catholicism. I found myself outside and against these ideological trends. Thus, I joined some scholars with whom I shared common experiences. That is, we were ex-communists, former cadres of the Communist Party without having become anti-communist, and we edited the journal Argument. Christos Memos. In your editorial with which the cessation of the journal Argument was announced, amongst other things, you noted that, quote, it is particularly difficult to learn how to talk and think, and, as for action, a long way to go is still needed in order to understand that, quote, transformation of the world, end quote, or, quote, change of life. What, quote, transformation of the world? Marx. Or, quote, change of life, Rambaud, meme. That's a very common thing within, like, the situationist, discussions of combining these imperatives of Marx and Rambaud. And I think that was actually I think it starts in the Surrealists, actually. Nor is it easy to give up the bad habits. Actually, I'm not sure about what I just said, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. Nor is it easy to give up the bad habits, to transcend stammers and screams, cliché and slogans, wishful thinking and, quote, future illusions, end quote. Why do the vast majority of Marxists remain, quote, closed, both in their thinking and action? Axelos. In each period of history and thought, an absolutely moderate mentality, an amalgamation of several trivialisms, prevails. It seems like people and societies are indifferent to great thoughts. On the contrary, a vulgar popularization of these thoughts dominates. Nowadays, only a few people adduce Marxist thought and Marxism. Even these people, however, do not relate to the vibration of Marxist thought. Instead, they only ask for minor theoretical and practical instructions. While in their action, they follow movements which are consistent with the mediocrity of our times. Christos Memos. You have written that, quote, Marxism has been involved in a complicated rigorousness. It has been drained like wood ready to fall from a previously green tree. ... To endorse the liberation of the living elements included in Marxism is without doubt painful, end quote. Axelos, 1989. Which do you think are these living elements, and how could they contribute to the opening of Marxism? Axelos. In order to enter into a productive dialogue with Marxist thought rather than Marxist theory, other great thinkers, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, should be employed, not to revitalize Marxism conventionally, but to maintain the problematic element of Marxist thought, open to and question it as a unity and from several aspects. Further, the bourgeois horizon, which mainly remains Marx's horizon, should be illuminated. Christos Memos. In the 1960s, you had already coined the term open Marxism. What did you mean exactly with open Marxism? How could this opening of Marxism lead to, quote, pulverization of the Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, Trotskyist, and anarchist sects and beyond them, end quote. Axelos. By using the term open Marxism, I meant a theoretical current which never came into being as a movement, and which in opposition to Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, did not render Marxism an ideology of power, but attempted to pose fruitful questions and demystify the so-called, quote, existing realizations, end quote. Lukács and Korsch made an effort, but their contemplative measures were limited. Any kind of action, political or non-political, cannot be defined a priori. Today, the critical question might be formulated, why are we not able to escape the predominant capitalist, petty bourgeois, and techno-bureaucratic form? Memos. How would you define the, quote, crisis of Marxism? Is this crisis related to the fact that Marxism is an integral part of contemporary European thought, which has always been in a substantial and perpetual crisis? Finally, does this crisis call for a, quote, new radicalism? Axelos. Marxism's crisis belongs to a more general crisis. The historical period we live in is and will be in crisis. Until when? None can predict it. The crisis reflects both Marxism as theory, its contemplative inadequacy, and practice, its application, which failed miserably. There seems to be a need for a new radicalism. I am saying, quote, it seems, end quote, since the question remains, is there a need in general? It might be quite radical to insist on asking the question and perceiving its preconditions and its consequences. Memos. What connects and disconnects Marxist thinking and Marxism? Is there a unity between Marxist thinking and Marxism, or is there anything in Marxist thought that has allowed the development and realization of certain versions / interpretations of his thought, social democracy, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, etc.? Axelos. What connects a thought with its, quote, practice, always remains problematic. Would another practice be possible? I would like to argue that there is both a continuation and a breaking continuation between Marx and Marxism. Nevertheless, there is a dogmatic element in Marxist thought itself, the closure of many questions. Memos, given your opinion that Marxist thought, like every great thought, is very significant and multidimensional, as well as that no understanding and interpretation exhaust their source, in which manner do you think that we should approach and, quote, read Marx? Axelos. One cannot propose a one-dimensional approach in reading of Marx. If someone did so, she would be dogmatic. What I suggest is to place Marx among the other thinkers of modernity, from Descartes to Heidegger, to whom Marx also belongs. That is, one needs to examine both the current to which he belongs, against his will, and his own contribution. The critique of theoretical thought, which mainly, but not only, remains theoretical. Also, the critique of individual and public practice, which we always hesitate to exercise vigorously, including ourselves in the object of critique. Memos. As you have stated, your aim has been to, quote, discover the intention of Marxist thought and follow it to its ultimate consequences by trying to hear the words of Marx. As a coherent, consistent, and all-embracing discourse, we shall set ourselves as well to make its truth shine out clearly. Make its truth shine out clearly. End quote. Axelos. This is still Memos speaking. When I repeat things, if you don't know, it's because it's in italics. What is the truth included in Marxist thought that we have to make shine out clearly? What is the main dimension, the central core, the revolutionary element in Marxian thought which we ought to bring to light, liberate and maintain as part of a, quote, new, open, and radical, end quote, thought action, in order to act as an alternative to capitalism? Axelos. The central core of a thought is not motionless. It resists various interpretations that get inspired by it. Each thinker should be rendered more problematic than he actually is. Can we understand a thinker better than he has understood himself? The question remains open. The rupture that has been indicated by Marx, the rupture between what we think and how we act, should be opened even more, so the rupture will be able to be productive. We have to deepen the rupture beyond illusions, self-deceptions, and the lies we tell ourselves and others, to bear its poignancy without aiming at easy solutions. The big question refers to a concrete epoch. That is, it includes people and societies, and it is dubious whether the question has been addressed to its greatest depth and extension. Is there or is there likely to be any alternative in the near future, or is there a great deal of time for the present situation to be generalized, to carry everything away, to get exhausted? Memos. On which foundations was your critique on Marx based? Did you exercise your critique on concrete elements of Marxist thought, or was your critique total? What exactly did you reject in his theory? How has the concept of technique influenced Marxist thought? Axelos. Marx reduced the open and multidimensional world, both to a material world as the product of the material labor and to an ideological superstructure. As a result, the liberation Marx was aiming at was and remained partial. This contemplative constraint and the lack of poetic dimension in the thought of Marxism's founder were obvious for all those who would like to deal with him more radically than critically. Marx considered technique as a driving force. However, he failed in conceiving its remote origin and its dominance over his own thought and action as well. Memos. How did you read Marx through Heidegger? Axelos. I did not read Marx through Heidegger, but I read Marx along with Heidegger. Despite their important differences, I was impressed by the concurrent affinity between what Marx calls alienation and what Heidegger oblivion of being. Is there anything for oblivion of being? No, I'm not seeing anything. This double reading led me to comprehend that Marx belongs to the history of metaphysics, which in its recent period regards man, subject, as its basis. Marx simply socializes subject man, believes in universal society, but this remains very prosaic, deprived of world. Memos. Does Marx provide us with the methodological and theoretical tools in order to proceed beyond or even against him? Axelos. Method and thought are not hermetically separated, are not two distinct entities. If I used way instead of method, I would say that in a friendly way, and in conjunction with Marx, one can go beyond and not against him. Memos. In your book entitled Alienation, Praxis, and Techne and the Thought of Karl Marx, you have noted that, quote, Marx's thought contains negativity, which is movement by supersession, and its negativity awaits the hour for breaking out into the open. By putting into action the negativity that is implied in the very movement of Marxian thought, we loosen the structural framework that blocks negativity. We restore fluidity to the rigidity of Marxian thought, end quote. Axelos, 1976. Given your above statement, do you think that you have put into action the negativity of Marxist thought? Have you attempted to radicalize and transcend it? Axelos. No one ever sufficiently puts into action the thought of the person he is discoursing with. There always remain important hidden elements which do not come to light. No thought can be transcended. All stay together, linked and separate, in the empyrean of thought. What we can succeed in, bearing in mind that success and defeat are not divided by a precipice, is to show but not to prove. That beyond any milestone, a thought like the one I am working on, drawing upon Heraclitus's poetic thought and beyond, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, can lead to a questioning thought and enigmatic responses. Memos. What has been your contribution to critical and radical thought? Axelos. I have attempted, and I am saying attempted because every thought is an endeavor, to propose a thought which within the horizon of errancy constitutes a thought of the world's gain. Historical thought, systematic and effective, open and multidimensional, poetic and planetary, which confronts man the staking of our era. Technique. The future of this endeavor does not belong to me, it belongs to time. Memos. You have stated that Marx considered, quote, material life as the only truly human one, while thought and poetry were understood only in their conditional and ideological forms. Hence he did not comprehend the significance of thought, calling everything into question, and keeping the question open, as thought daring to see that every great victory is the prelude to defeat, end quote. Axelos. Granted that there is, this is still Memos asking a question. That past thing was a quote from Axelos. Granted that there is talk regarding the, quote, defeat of Marxist thought, end quote, or the, quote, defeat of the socialist movement, end quote, could we also make the opposite claim, that is, every great defeat is the prelude to victory? Axelos. Victory and defeat are and remain inseparable. In every possible way, all the great things are successful by being unsuccessful. The open world that every individual and historical experience contains is the cradle and the grave of each reflection and experience, and the game is continued. Memos. In your essay entitled, Is There a Marxist Philosophy?, you've maintained that, quote, the left seems to have dried up because she did not want or was not able any more to refer to ... the foundation of world history, end quote. Axelos. What is this foundation? How is it possible for a movement that disputes capitalism to recognize this foundation? What about the so-called, quote, anti-globalization movement, end quote? Axelos. World history is evolved by us, by human beings, while at the same time it surpasses decisively our theories, our plans, and our wills. What we call its foundation or motive is lost in history's vortex and in the unimaginable fatigue of this too exhausted phase of history, within which we live, think, act, and die. Existing globalization, in its current meaning of the concept, because it is decisively lacking in open world, integrates and undermines the alternatives, for the latter act on the same level that they fight against. So, what is left? A living communing with nature, the friendliness that goes together with militancy, an endeavor of a radical thought which does not close itself within its limits, the erotic errancy, the unmasking of the political theater which is not only theater. It is also left the vivid and critical political participation, as well as the active and passive struggle, where and when it is possible, provided it does not foster illusions, the change of the level in which they want to locate us, our vigilant participation in a game that does not close all openings. We must have not avoided practicing what is given to us and is being transformed. That's the end of the interview. Interview conducted in Greek and translated in English by Christos Memos, Paris, 20th of July, 2006. Translation checked and authorized by Kostas Axelos. And there's a little biography of Christos Memos that I'll read, because why not? Christos Memos teaches in the Department of Politics, University of York. He holds a BA in Education Studies, a BA in Sociology, an MA in Political Philosophy, and a PhD in Politics/Political Theory. Memos' PhD thesis examined the critical theory of Axelos, Castoriadis, and Papaioannou and their assessment of Marxism and Marx. His research interests include social and political theory, especially critical theory, political and historical sociology, Marx and critical Marxism, anarchism in Soviet-type societies, USSR, China, Cuba. His recent publications include Neoliberalism, Identification Process, and the Dialectics of Crisis, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, forthcoming, and Anarchism and Council Communism on the Class Nature of the Soviet Union, which is on this channel. And then there's some notes. Let's see if there's anything. A lot of foreign languages in these notes. References. Johannes Agnoli, 2003, Destruction as the Determination of the Scholar in Miserable Times, in Werner Bonefeld's edited volume, Revolutionary Writing. Axelos, 1976, Alienation, Praxis, and Techne in the Thought of Karl Marx. Kostas Axelos, 1982, Theses on Marx, in N. Fischer, N. Georgopoulos, and L. Pastoris, in Continuity and Change in Marxism. Kostas Axelos, Is There a Marxist Philosophy? And Towards a Planetary Thought. Konstantin Cavafy, Walls, in The Complete Poems of Cavafy. Stuart Eldon, 2005, Mondialisation Without the World. Kostas Axelos, interviewed by Stuart Eldon. Mark Poster, 1975, Existential Marxism in Post-War France. Works by Kostas Axelos in English. 1968, Planetary Interlude. 1970, Marx, Freud, and the Undertakings of Thought in the Future. 1976, Alienation, Praxis, and Techne and the Thought of Karl Marx. 1979, The Sets Gameplay of Sets. 1980, Play as the System of Systems. 1982, Theses on Marx. N. Fischer, N. Georgopoulos, and L. Pastoris, edited volume Continuity and Change in Marxism. In 2006, The World, Becoming Totality. The end. Thanks for listening.